Governor, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today in the midst of everything that's going on. Kansas has seen protests in the wake of George Floyd's death, like many other states across the country. What do you think your role as governor is right now?
Well, this is an issue that has been on my mind since I was 17 years old and worked with kids of color in the inner city and at camps in New York. Uh, I was in college when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I saw the fallout from all of that. I experienced that. I lived through all the protests on the Vietnam War. And what I'm seeing today is the kind of passion and determination that was needed to make change then and is needed to make change now. So I obviously, it's a tragic situation that brought us here, but it's just sort of opened our eyes to what's been going on for a very long time. The systemic racism really permeates our entire society and has for centuries. And so I'm looking forward to working with the stakeholders in all of this, and I consider young people probably the greatest stakeholders in all of this, to really make a change and make a systemic change so that it's not something we just talk about, it's not something we put a band-aid on, it's something that we actually work now and into the future to change.
Now, some young activists have put forth something called the Eight Can't Wait campaign. And police departments across Kansas have actually responded to some of these proposals, which includes things like banning chokeholds by police and requiring de escalation tactics. So, what would you like to see police departments in Kansas do?
Well, I can tell you that my daughter was the one who let me know about the Eight Can't Wait, and so probably a couple of weeks ago, she shared that with me, and that certainly will be on the table for discussion. I am just now putting together our commission that will be doing a deep dive on all of these issues. We are going to have the appropriate people at the table, leaders in the African American community, leaders in the Latino community, to take a good look at this. We'll include law enforcement, we'll include academics, we will include folks impacted by this, and we'll bring them together, and the Eight Can't Wait will be on the table as something to discuss. I don't want to set their agenda for them right now. I would like for the experts to come and say, what do we need to focus on? When do we need to focus on it? And then make the recommendations, and then we act.
One other proposed reform that I read about Democratic lawmakers in Kansas putting forth is to open up police records to the public and to prevent officers who are fired due to excessive force from getting a job in another department in another county. Do you support that kind of reform?
I haven't seen it in its printed form yet. I've heard about it. It's hard for me to imagine that I wouldn't support that. I mean, we do that for childcare providers. We do that for all sort of people who want to work in nursing homes. That you're able to take a look back and see how they performed and whether there were any issues. We do that with doctors. There are ways of looking at registries and seeing if they have malpractice suits or whatever. So I can't understand why we wouldn't do that, but I'll wait until I actually see it to make a final judgment. But again, I think that's something that ought to be on the commission's agenda.
Do you think that there's bipartisan support in Kansas for these types of proposals?
Well, we will see. Certainly the commission that I'm putting together is bipartisan. Party label was not a consideration as we were asking these people to come to the table. I have a long record of working in a bipartisan manner. I am a Democrat. I'm in the minority, have always been in the minority in the legislature. And so that's my natural inclination to work that way and generally work towards bipartisan resolutions. Actually, there's no other way to do it because you got to have 21 votes in the Senate and 63 votes in the House before I can put my signature on it. So, yeah, I have no doubt that it'll be a bipartisan effort.
Even outside of Eight Can't Wait, some other young activists across the country have been calling for defunding police or reducing police budgets. Do you think that that will also be on the table?
Well, I think the defunding the police is a really unfortunate phrase because I don't think it really tells us what they're thinking about. I think the issue is, you know, should the police be getting the kind of funding they get versus some other areas that might be able to work in partnership with our police to really solve some of our public safety issues. So I think we look at that. I already have a police department in Kansas, right here in my hometown of Topeka, who have embedded social workers, mental health professionals in the police force for years. And so when they get a call where clearly the issue is one of mental health, the mental health professional will go along with the police officer to de-escalate and deal with the issue, and then hopefully divert that person from the prison side of the discussion to the rehab side of the discussion. So we already have models for that here. And so I think that's what we're really going to be looking at is not so much defunding the police. We need our police. They are, they're our first responders. So they're very important folks to have on the ground. I'm the granddaughter of a New York City police officer. So I have great appreciation for them. And so no interest in defunding or dismantling the police force, but I do think we can look at ways that we can use a more integrated, holistic approach to public safety.
So you're focused on reform more than anything.
I think, yes, I'm absolutely focused on reform. It's clear we've needed it for a long time. This is an opportunity. It's very tragic, as you well know, as have so many of the other, police violence against blacks that have occurred over the years. But I think it's important for us to sort of seize this moment that George Floyd has created for us, and take real action on the things that we've been talking about for decades.
Now, switching gears to coronavirus, I saw that as of Monday, Kansas has moved into a phase 3 of reopening, I believe, and that includes residents being able to gather in groups of up to 45 people. That seems to be a more lax or sort of different restriction than what we're seeing elsewhere in the country. So are you concerned about the reopening leading to another spike in cases, and how are you going to deal with that?
No, we have really taken a very cautious, very scientific, data-driven approach to our reopening. And so we felt very comfortable moving into phase 3, which I must remind you that, given what our legislature did, I can just make recommendations now and present guidance for our local units of government. They're the ones who will actually make the final decision about how it will look. But we feel really good. We follow the metrics very closely. So we know how many hospitalizations we have. We know what our testing is doing. We know what contact tracing is doing. And we know what our capacity is. So I am very comfortable that we've moved into the phase in a reasonable time frame. I might also say that we didn't just do this all by ourselves. When we developed this phased in reopening, we brought together, folks from, the hospitality industry, from our parks and recreation divisions, from just about everywhere, hairdressers, and said, okay, how can you open safely? So I've got to give a lot of our industry sectors credit for coming up with safety protocols that really made it possible for us to open up, even at the reduced level that we've done.
Now, you mentioned what happened with your emergency powers in the legislature. This is something I'm not sure our audience knows about. So I would love for you to explain the compromise that you had to make with Republican lawmakers and how you think that affects your ability to handle the outbreak.
Well, our Emergency Management Act, I think, was recodified in the early 90s. And it was really designed to deal with our tornadoes and our floods and our wildfires. We've never had anything like COVID-19 pandemic to deal with. So the Emergency Management Act needs to be modified, needs to be reformed. It should not have been done the way that it was done, and it should be done, with a very careful study of and recognition of the implications of whatever changes we might make, and then pass. Instead, the legislature chose to just, dive right in, and they initially presented drastic changes and limitations to my emergency powers, which I think would have threatened the health and safety of Kansans. So I vetoed it, and then called them back in for a special session, worked behind the scenes with legislative leadership to come up with a compromise that could get us through until the next legislative session in a way that I'm comfortable we can work together to ensure that I can exercise enough power to make sure we're getting to the Kansas communities and to the people what they need to stay safe and really for our economy to grow again throughout this period.
Do you think that state Republicans in Kansas would have been so adamant about that if President Trump hadn't been pushing this sort of national line to reopen the economy, even when public health experts were saying we're not quite ready yet?
No, I really don't think this had much to do with what's going on at a federal level. I think this is pretty typical Kansas state politics. That I am a Democrat, and our both chambers are being led by some pretty conservative Republicans, and so this was really an internal battle. We had a Senate president who was running for United States Senate at the time. She's since dropped out of that race. But so there was a lot of politicking going on, and a lot of ideological, flags being sent up, messages being sent. So no, I don't think what was going on at the federal level had anything to do with it. I think it was just all local. It's not something unusual for me. This is my 16th year in Topeka within the state capitol, 14 years in the state Senate. When I came into the state Senate in 2005, there were 10 Democrats in the Senate, 30 Republicans. It was clear to me that I had to work across the aisle, make friends across the aisle if I was ever going to get anything done. I've continued that, and that's what happened during the special session when we came up with a compromise on the emergency management powers.
Now, there have been some outbreaks at prisons across the country. I believe the Lansing Correctional Facility is the 14th biggest cluster of COVID-19 cases, according to the New York Times. Now, your government has said that the outbreak there is contained. So what are you doing to keep prisoners safe?
Well, we really took a very aggressive approach to this because, along with our nursing homes, our prisons were the first to really suffer outbreaks. We developed, I think, probably about as good a system as you possibly could to finally reach this containment level. The prisons are, by their very nature, difficult for isolation and quarantine. There are a lot of people in a relatively small space. So what we did was design a system of cohorts so that we put prisoners in groups, and they went everywhere they would go, whether it was, for recreation, for food, for showers, for whatever it might be. They went in the same group so that if something happened, if somebody came down with COVID-19 in that cohort, the contact tracing was really easy, and we were able to quarantine those particular people, not infecting everybody else. So it took a while, but by sustaining that with the help of, we had our Health and Environment Department embedded epidemiologists within the prison. Our National Guard came in with some of their medical personnel and were able to help us put all of this together and make this work. So I feel very good about how we handled the corrections problem. And I think we learned a lot, and we'll be ready for the second wave.
Now, in 2018, your race was against Kris Kobach, who is one of the nation's sort of modern architects of voter suppression that we've seen, and he went on to work for Trump in a similar capacity. So, how did that impact your understanding of voting rights?
Um, it just sort of reinforced what I had always thought. I was a teenager when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and so that again has always been part of my upbringing and my professional life, and so I think Kris Kobach just sort of brought to the forefront the very worst and the very most obvious ways that voter suppression can take place. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that right now in our state, with our Secretary of State refusing to go to all mail ballots for the fall, but rather suggesting that Kansans would be confused by all mail ballots, and that they want to go to the polling place. And I think it's clear that's a smokescreen for suppressing the vote, and particularly the votes that might not be supportive of the ideologically right agenda. So we will do what we can here in Kansas to uh, really push voter education and voter training, and do whatever we can to support people, given that I really don't have any power to override the Secretary of State. That's an elected position in and of its own that has the power to control how those operate. But I think our office can do things to make sure that we support people's right to vote in a lot of ways, and we will do that.
So you've got a Republican Secretary of State, a Republican state legislature. You won in what is generally considered a pretty red state. So what is your advice to other Democrats about how what they can take away from your election?
I think you know you read what the people are thinking. I mean, first I want people. I never really wanted to be governor. This was not in my life's plan. But I had just lived through being a state senator. I just lived through 8 years of the Brownback Collier administration and the devastation that was wreaked upon our state during that time. And I knew that our state could not survive another 4 years of a Kobach administration. We needed to be on the road to recovery, not continue down the path of destruction. So I decided to run, and I was right. What the people wanted was just a steady force, common sense, with the people's good in mind. And so I think you have to be pragmatic. You have to understand that. There is a middle of the road, and that's where you need to drive down. Um, and you'll be able to get a whole lot more done if you work with others, and don't expect to always get your own way, and don't always expect to take all the credit. And I think if you do that, and it'll be responsive, particularly in states that have had divisive situations, I think that Democrats have a great opportunity to show what real leadership looks like, and leadership that has the best interests of the people in mind and is not done for purely political reasons or personal gain.
It's great. Governor, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.